They said Thomas Farwell was digging his own grave. Not because he was sick, and not because the war had broken him, though some of the men in the Gallatin Valley whispered both. No, it was because he was digging a tunnel. A tunnel to his barn. 40 yards of dirt, timber, and sweat, carved under open prairie like something a miner or a madman would attempt, not a rancher trying to survive. All summer, his neighbors watched him haul wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow of earth, reinforcing the passage with heavy posts like he expected the ground itself to collapse on him. And every time he explained what he was building, they laughed harder. Because who in their right mind would bury himself underground just to avoid a short walk in the snow? But when the winter of 1873 arrived in Montana Territory 3 weeks early, it didn't come gently. It came like a verdict. By the second week of November, the temperature had already dropped to 20 below zero, and every rancher in the valley understood what that meant. Survival would not be measured in comfort this year. It would be measured in cattle still breathing when spring finally returned. It would be measured in whether a man could reach his animals through wind and whiteout without freezing where he stood. And on that first bitter morning, as the valley tightened itself for a season that promised ruin, Thomas Farwell stood at the window of his cabin, watching his breath fog the glass, and he allowed himself a thin, private smile. Let them laugh. Thomas was 38 years old that year, a former Army corpsman who'd mustered out after the war and decided the wide, open spaces of Montana Territory suited him better than the crowded cities back east. He'd purchased his land 2 years prior, 160 acres under the Homestead Act, and he'd built his operation carefully, methodically, the way he'd been trained to approach problems in the service. A modest cabin, well-chinked and positioned to catch the southern sun. A barn 40 yards to the north, large enough for 12 head of cattle, 2 horses, and sufficient hay storage to see them through a hard winter. A root cellar. A chicken coop. A well that ran clean and cold. But it was that 40 yards between cabin and barn that occupied his thoughts during his first Montana winter. He'd watched his neighbors struggle through the blizzards, seen them rope themselves to guidelines just to make the twice-daily trek to feed their animals. He'd heard the story about Jacob Hendricks, found frozen solid 15 feet from his own door, disoriented in a whiteout, dead from exposure in the time it took to walk across his own yard. The frontier had 100 ways to kill a man, but the casual efficiency of winter was particularly cruel. You could do everything right and still die simply because you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Most ranchers accepted this as the natural order of things. You bundled up, you moved fast, you trusted your sense of direction, and you prayed the wind didn't steal your breath. Some strung ropes between buildings, thick hemp lines that you could follow hand over hand, even when the snow came horizontal and the world turned white. This was the conventional wisdom. This was what every experienced frontiersman did. Thomas had strung such a rope his first year, and he'd used it a dozen times, arriving at his barn with ice in his beard and frost in his lungs, his fingers so cold he could barely work the latch. But Thomas Farwell had spent 3 years in the Army Corps of Engineers before transferring to the Medical Corps, and he'd learned something about tunnels during the siege work in Virginia. He'd learned that earth, properly excavated and supported, could provide protection that no above-ground structure could match. He'd learned about temperature stability underground, about how the earth itself maintained a consistent warmth even when the surface world froze solid. And during that first brutal Montana winter, an idea had taken root in his mind. An unconventional idea. An idea that, when he'd first mentioned it to his neighbor Robert Christensen the following spring, had been met with open laughter. A tunnel, Christensen had repeated, wiping tears from his eyes. Thomas, that might be the damn fool idea I've ever heard. The amount of work, the timber you'd need, the shoring, the drainage. And for what? To save yourself a 40-yard walk. Thomas had tried to explain. It wasn't about the walk. It was about reliability, about removing chance from the equation. It was about never having to choose between your own safety and the survival of your animals. It was about creating a protected corridor that would function in any weather, any conditions, no matter how severe. But Christensen had already moved on, already sharing the story with others. By the time Thomas broke ground in late May of 1873, the whole valley knew about Farwell's folly. The tunnel itself would need to be 6 feet deep at its shallowest point, dropping to 7 feet beneath the frost line. 4 feet wide, with a ceiling height of 6.5 feet to allow comfortable passage. The distance was 40 yards, 120 feet of excavation through Montana clay and rock. He calculated he'd move approximately 27 cubic yards of earth. At a rate of roughly 1 cubic yard per day, working alone, the excavation alone would take him most of the summer. He started from the barn side, digging a sloping entrance that descended at a gentle angle, something a man could walk down without feeling like he was descending into a mine shaft. The earth came out hard and dense, clay mixed with stones ranging from pebbles to rocks the size of his fist. He worked in the mornings when the summer heat was bearable, for hours before breakfast, and he worked methodically, setting timber supports every 6 feet as he progressed. These were serious timbers, not scraps. 8x8 posts he'd ordered from the mill in Bozeman, each one treated with pitch to resist rot. The horizontal supports were 6x6 beams, notched and fitted with the precision he'd learned in the Corps. His neighbors came by to watch. They always came by to watch when someone was doing something unusual, drawn by curiosity even as they prepared their mockery. "You'll hit groundwater," predicted Samuel Morrison, who ran cattle on the adjacent property. 20 feet in, you'll be swimming. But Thomas had studied the drainage patterns on his land, had noted where the spring runoff flowed, where the ground stayed dry. He angled his tunnel to follow the natural grade, ensuring any moisture would flow toward the barn end where he'd excavated a small sump that could be bucketed out if needed. By mid-July, he was 30 feet in, and he'd hit neither water nor rock substantial enough to stop his progress. The tunnel stayed surprisingly dry, and inside, even on the hottest days, the temperature held steady at around 55 degrees. This was the first validation of his theory. While the surface baked under the August sun, inside his tunnel the air stayed cool and constant. If it worked in summer, keeping heat out, it would work in winter, keeping warmth in. The timbering pattern was critical. Every 6 feet, a complete frame, 2 vertical posts, 1 horizontal beam across the top, 1 crossbrace at the bottom. Between these frames, he installed planking along the ceiling and upper walls, rough-cut pine boards 2 inches thick. This served 2 purposes. It prevented cave-ins, and it created an air gap between the earth and the passage itself. That air gap would provide additional insulation, a buffer zone that would prevent the cold from conducting through the soil directly into his tunnel. "Awful lot of work for a man who could just wear a heavier coat," observed William Kemp, whose property lay to the south. Thomas didn't argue. He'd learned that trying to convince men before they'd seen proof was wasted breath. Instead, he offered Kemp a dipper of water from the bucket he kept in the tunnel. "Notice anything?" he asked. Kemp drank, then paused, then looked around. "It's cold," he said. "The water's cold." Thomas nodded. "It's 93 degrees above ground right now. Down here, it's 55. Same temperature as your root cellar. Same principle." But Kemp just shrugged and handed back the dipper. Root cellars were one thing. Everyone understood root cellars. But a tunnel to your barn? That was something different. That was eccentric. That was the kind of thing that marked you as odd, as someone who didn't quite understand how things were properly done. By September, Thomas had completed the excavation. 120 feet of tunnel, sloping gently from the barn entrance down 7 feet below grade, then rising slightly to meet a similar entrance he'd excavated into the back wall of his cabin, accessible through a door he'd cut into what had been his storage room. The entire passage was timbered, planked, and fitted with oil lamps mounted every 20 feet along the walls. He'd installed wooden duckboards on the floor, raised platforms that kept your feet off the bare earth and allowed any moisture to drain beneath. At the barn end, he'd built a proper door, thick planks hung on iron hinges, with a latch that could be worked from either side. The final touch was insulation. He'd saved this for last, and it required another innovation that drew fresh mockery. He spent 2 weeks cutting sod, thick squares of prairie grass and root-bound earth, and laying them on top of the tunnel's length, directly above his planked ceiling. The sod layer was 18 inches thick, running the entire length of the tunnel, and it transformed the excavation into something more like a natural feature of the landscape. The grass continued to grow, fed by rain and snow, and those roots, that organic mass, provided insulation value that exceeded anything man-made. Beneath that living blanket, Thomas knew his tunnel would stay temperate regardless of what happened on the surface. His neighbors thought he'd truly lost his mind with the sod layer. "You've built yourself an underground hill," said Christensen, shaking his head. "All that work, and you've made a hill, with a hole through it." The laughter that followed was good-natured but dismissive. These were practical men, men who measured worth in results they could understand. A barn was worth the timber and nails because it sheltered animals. A fence was worth the posts and wire because it contained livestock. But a tunnel? A tunnel was worth nothing until it proved itself. And how exactly do you prove the worth of a tunnel when you could just walk across your own yard? October brought the first snow, light dustings that melted by afternoon. Thomas made a habit of using his tunnel exclusively, partly to test it, partly to condition himself to the route. 40 paces from his cabin door to the bottom of the entrance ramp. 87 paces through the tunnel itself, past 4 lamp stations, beneath the earth. 35 paces up the barnside ramp to emerge in the warm animal smell of hay and cattle. Total time, 3 minutes at a comfortable walk. And during those 3 minutes, he was completely protected from wind, from snow, from cold. The temperature in the tunnel stabilized at 52 degrees. Not warm, exactly, but remarkably comfortable compared to the surface. Thomas wore a light coat for the passage, nothing more. Meanwhile, his neighbors were already bundling into heavy furs for their outdoor treks, already lighting lanterns to guide them through the early darkness, already stringing fresh ropes because the old ones had frayed over summer. November came hard, as it had a habit of doing in Montana territory. The temperature dropped to 0, then 10 below, then 20 below, and stayed there. The snow came in waves, each storm dropping another 6 inches, then 8, then 10. By mid-month, there was 3 feet of accumulated snow across the valley, and the ranchers were settling into the long siege of winter. Feed your stock twice a day. Keep the water troughs from freezing. Conserve firewood. Pray for an early thaw. Thomas's routine remained unchanged. Twice a day, he descended into his tunnel, walked its length in perfect comfort, and emerged in his barn. He fed his cattle, checked their water, ensured the chickens were producing, then returned via the same route. His total exposure to the elements each day, 0 minutes. His neighbors noticed. Of course they noticed. When Thomas emerged from his cabin on a morning when the wind chill was hitting 40 below, and he was wearing nothing heavier than a wool coat, they noticed. When Christensen nearly lost 2 fingers to frostbite making his morning barn run, and Thomas strolled over that afternoon to lend him some salve, warm and comfortable and completely unfrosted, they noticed. But noticing isn't the same as understanding, and understanding isn't the same as accepting. "Must be nice," was all Christensen said, his bandaged hand cradled against his chest. "Must be nice to live underground like some kind of animal." The resentment in his voice was clear. Thomas had violated an unspoken rule of frontier life. You were supposed to suffer together. The hardship was supposed to be shared. By removing himself from that shared suffering, Thomas had set himself apart, and that apartness bred suspicion and dislike in equal measure. What Thomas's neighbors couldn't understand until they experienced it themselves, was the psychological freedom his tunnel provided. He never had to steel himself before opening his door, never had to pause, gathering courage for the brutal passage across his yard, never had to gamble that the weather would hold for just 5 more minutes, just long enough to finish the feeding. The tunnel removed fear from the equation. It transformed winter from an adversary into a mere inconvenience. But winter had other plans. Winter always does. The storm that would later be called the Gallatin Valley Blizzard of '73 began on the evening of December 3rd. The signs were obvious to anyone who'd spent time in Montana. The pressure drop that made your ears pop, the strange stillness in the air, the way the horses grew agitated in their stalls. Thomas spent the afternoon of December 3rd making preparations. He brought extra firewood into the cabin, stacking it high beside the stove. He filled every bucket and barrel with water from the well. He checked his tunnel, ensuring the lamps were full, the duckboards clear, the doors functioning properly. Then he descended one final time to the barn and confirmed he had sufficient hay to feed his herd for a week if necessary. The snow began at dusk, soft flakes that quickly grew heavier, denser, driven by a wind that rose from gentle breeze to howling gale in the span of an hour. By midnight, visibility was 0. By dawn on December 4th, the temperature had dropped to 30 below 0, and the wind was adding another 20 degrees of chill to that already lethal number. 50 below zero, adjusted for wind. The kind of cold that kills exposed flesh in minutes. The kind of cold that makes breathing painful and thinking slow. Thomas spent that first day warm in his cabin, feeding his stove, reading from his small collection of books, descending periodically into his tunnel to check on his herd. The cattle were calm, adequately fed, protected from the storm by the barn's thick walls. The tunnel remained at 52 degrees, completely unaffected by the chaos above. Walking its length, Thomas could hear the storm only as a distant muffled roar, like the sound of a train passing far away. But his neighbors were suffering. Robert Christensen's cabin was well built, but the wind found every crack and gap, and his stove couldn't keep pace with the cold draining through the walls. His rope to the barn had torn loose during the night, ripped away by winds that were gusting to 60 miles per hour. He had no way to reach his animals, no way to feed them, no way to even know if they were alive or frozen. All he could do was tend his own fire and hope the storm passed before his cattle died of starvation or cold. Samuel Morrison faced the same dilemma, with the added problem that his barn was farther from his cabin than Christensen's, a full 60 yards. Even with a rope, attempting that crossing in these conditions would be suicide. The wind would steal your breath. The cold would numb your fingers until you couldn't grip. The whiteout would turn you around until you didn't know which direction you were walking. He'd heard the stories. Everyone had. Men found frozen 3 feet from their own doors, disoriented in the final seconds of life. William Kemp was luckier. His barn was attached to his cabin, connected by a covered breezeway that provided some protection from the elements. But some protection, in these conditions, meant he could make the passage without dying, not that he could make it comfortably. He wrapped himself in every layer he owned, tied a scarf around his face until only his eyes showed, and forced himself to make the trek twice daily. Each trip left him shaking and blue, and it took an hour by the fire before feeling returned to his extremities. The storm continued through December 4th, 5th, and 6th. 3 days of unrelenting wind and snow and cold that pushed even deeper into lethal territory. 40 below on the thermometer, 60 below with the wind chill. The kind of cold that made houses crack and groan, that froze water solid in minutes, that killed animals in their sleep if their shelter wasn't adequate. On the morning of December 7th, Thomas made his usual descent into his tunnel. 52 degrees. Calm air. Steady lamplight. He walked the length to his barn and found his cattle chewing contentedly on their hay, their breath steaming in the air that was cold by human standards, but perfectly adequate for animals bred to northern climates. He fed them, checked their water, collected eggs from the chickens who were still laying despite the nightmare conditions above. Then he returned to his cabin, made breakfast, and settled in to wait out the storm's remainder. That same morning, Robert Christensen made a decision that almost killed him. 3 days without feeding his stock. 3 days of not knowing if they were alive or dead. He couldn't bear it any longer. He wrapped himself in every heavy garment he owned, tied a rope around his waist, secured the other end to his door handle, and stepped out into the maelstrom. The wind hit him like a physical blow, nearly knocking him off his feet. The cold went through his layers as if they weren't there, burning his exposed skin, freezing the moisture in his nostrils. He couldn't see anything. The world was white. The wind was cold beyond comprehension. He oriented himself by memory, by the mental map he carried of his own property, and started walking. 20 yards. That's how far he made it before he fell. 40 yards remained. His feet had gone numb, and he'd stepped into a drift without realizing it. Snow up to his thighs, and he went down hard. The rope jerked tight around his waist. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. His hands, even in heavy gloves, were losing feeling. Panic set in, the kind of panic that kills more men in the wilderness than cold or hunger. He'd made a mistake, a fatal mistake. He was saved by his wife, Anna, who'd been watching from the window in terror. When the rope went slack suddenly, then pulled taut, she knew. She tied her into the stove's iron leg and began hauling, hand over hand, pulling her husband back toward the cabin. Christensen had the presence of mind to stop fighting, to let himself be dragged. 5 minutes later, she had him through the door, shaking uncontrollably, his face white with frostbite, 3 fingers on his right hand frozen solid. That night, When the word spread about Christensen's close call, the valley's ranchers faced a grim reality. The storm showed no signs of breaking. The cold was, if anything, intensifying. The official thermometer at the land office in Bozeman would eventually record a low of -42 degrees on December 8th, without accounting for wind chill. With the wind, conditions were hitting 60 below zero. This wasn't whether you could survive exposed. This wasn't whether you could fight. Most of the ranchers made a brutal calculation. Better to lose the stock than to lose their lives attempting to reach them. They stayed inside, fed their fires, and prayed for a break in the weather. The cattle would have to fend for themselves. Some would survive. Some wouldn't. That was the calculus of frontier life. But Thomas Farwell faced no such choice. On the morning of December 8th, at the storm's absolute peak, he descended into his tunnel wearing his standard wool coat, walked 120 feet through air that remained a steady 52 degrees, and emerged in his barn. His cattle were fine. His horses were fine. His chickens were still laying. He fed them all, refreshed their water from the well he'd dug inside the barn for precisely this purpose, and spent an hour simply sitting on a hay bale, listening to the distant scream of wind that couldn't touch him. The storm finally broke on December 9th. 6 days total, 5 of them at survival-threatening intensity. When the wind finally died and the snow stopped falling, the temperature remained brutally cold, but the visibility returned. Cabin doors opened across the valley. Men emerged, bundled and cautious, to assess the damage. Christensen's cattle were dead. All 11 of them, frozen in their barn where they'd starved without feed for 6 days. The loss represented 2 years of investment, the value of the herd, and most of his hope for prosperity. He stood in his barn, staring at the frozen carcasses, and wept openly. Morrison fared slightly better. His barn had better insulation, and his cattle had survived, though they were drastically weakened. 2 would die in the following week. The rest would take months to recover their weight. His breeding program was set back a full year. Kemp's animals survived, protected by his attached barn and his twice-daily feeding trips. But Kemp himself paid the price. The frostbite on his face would leave permanent scars. 3 toes on his left foot had frozen and would eventually require amputation. He'd kept his stock alive, but he'd damaged himself in the process. And Thomas Farwell's herd was completely unaffected. His cattle had been fed and watered twice daily throughout the entire storm. His chickens had continued laying. His horses were healthy and calm. He'd burned through his hay supply faster than he'd anticipated, but he had sufficient stores. The storm that had devastated his neighbor's operations had been, for Thomas, nothing more than an inconvenience. The news spread slowly but inevitably. Christensen, after burying his pride along with his dead cattle, came to Thomas's cabin 3 days after the storm. His bandaged hand was healing, though he'd lost parts of 3 fingers to frostbite. His face was haggard. "I need to see it," he said simply. "I need to see this tunnel of yours." Thomas led him to the entrance in his cabin, down the sloping ramp, into the earth. Christensen stopped at the bottom of the ramp, his eyes adjusting to the lamplight, his mind adjusting to the temperature. "It's warm," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "My God, Thomas, it's actually warm down here." 52 degrees, Thomas confirmed. "Year-round, near enough. The Earth maintains its own temperature below the frost line. All I did was create a protected path through it." They walked the length of the tunnel together, Christensen running his hands along the timber supports, examining the construction with the eye of a man who'd spent his life building things. At the barn end, he saw Thomas's healthy cattle, saw the neat stacks of hay, saw the well with its bucket and windlass. He saw a man who'd prepared for disaster and had been rewarded with survival. "I laughed at you," Christensen said quietly. "We all did. We thought you were crazy." Thomas shrugged. "Most innovations seem crazy until they work." "How long did it take you?" "To dig it, to build it?" "For months. Start to finish. May through August. Working mornings, for hours a day." Christensen did the calculation in his head. 4 hours a day, for 4 months. Perhaps 400 hours of labor total, plus the cost of timber, perhaps $100 for materials. Against that investment, his entire herd was saved. No exposure to lethal weather. No risk of death or injury. The equation was so obviously favorable that he felt foolish for not seeing it earlier. "Could you help me build one?" he asked. "When the ground thaws. I'll pay you for your time, and I'll help with the labor. But I need you to show me how." Thomas extended his intact, unfrostbitten hand. I'll do better than that. I'll help you for free. Because next winter, I want neighbors who survive. I want neighbors whose cattle live. I want to live in a valley where men don't freeze to death walking to their own barns. Word traveled fast in frontier communities, especially word about survival. By spring of 1874, Thomas Farwell had received visits from 23 different ranchers and homesteaders across the Gallatin Valley, each asking about his tunnel, each requesting advice on construction. He drew diagrams on pieces of brown paper. He explained the importance of depth, of drainage, of proper timbering. He emphasized the insulation value of sod, the necessity of maintaining air gaps, the benefit of oil lamps positioned to provide light without heating the air. Some men nodded politely and went home to think about it. Others started digging that same spring. Robert Christensen's tunnel was completed by July, 45 yards from cabin to barn, following Thomas's specifications exactly. William Kemp, tired of his attached barn and the constant smell of animals in his living space, dug a tunnel to a new barn he built specifically to be tunnel accessible. Samuel Morrison, who'd lost cattle in the storm, hired 2 laborers and had his tunnel finished in 6 weeks. The following winter, the winter of 74 to 75, was milder than the year before. But in 1876, Montana experienced another brutal season, with multiple storms dropping the temperature below 40 below zero. By then, 14 ranches in the Gallatin Valley had tunnel access to their barns. Not one of those 14 lost stock to the weather. Not one of those ranchers faced the terrible choice between their own safety and their animals' survival. The technique spread beyond Gallatin. Travelers carried the story north to Helena, south to Virginia City, east to Yellowstone country. Some dismissed it as impractical. Some adapted it to their own circumstances. A few improved upon Thomas's design, adding ventilation systems, incorporating root cellars halfway along the tunnel's length, creating underground storage areas for tools and feed. In 1878, a newspaper correspondent from Chicago visited Montana and wrote a feature story about frontier innovations. He interviewed Thomas Farwell, describing him as a man of remarkable foresight whose simple tunnel has saved countless livestock and likely several human lives. The story was reprinted in newspapers across the country. Thomas received letters from farmers in Minnesota, ranchers in Wyoming, homesteaders in the Dakotas, all asking for details, all seeking to learn from his experience. Thomas answered every letter. He sent diagrams. He explained the principles. He encouraged experimentation and adaptation. He never charged for his knowledge, never sought to profit from his innovation beyond the practical benefit it provided his own operation. His motivation had never been financial gain. It had been survival. And in the harsh mathematics of frontier life, survival was the only currency that truly mattered. By 1880, an estimated 70 to 90 tunnels had been constructed across Montana, Wyoming, and Dakota territories, all following variants of Thomas Farwell's original design. The exact number was impossible to determine because many were built by isolated homesteaders who never reported their construction to any authority. But the impact was measurable in the survival statistics. Ranches with tunnel access to barns experienced dramatically lower livestock losses during severe weather. Homesteaders with tunnels suffered fewer cold-related injuries and deaths. The technique had its limitations, of course. It required soil that would hold excavation without excessive shoring. It required timber for supports, which was expensive in treeless regions. It required time, labor, and a willingness to invest effort in prevention rather than reaction. Not every location was suitable. Not every rancher had the resources. But for those who did, for those who could, the tunnel represented a fundamental shift in how humans could relate to hostile weather. Thomas Farwell lived on his Montana ranch until 1903, when age and arthritis finally convinced him to move to the milder climate of Oregon to live with his daughter. He was 68 years old when he left the valley, and his tunnel was still functioning perfectly, still maintaining its steady 52 degrees, still providing safe passage between cabin and barn. The property sold quickly to a young rancher from Iowa who'd read about the tunnel in a magazine article and specifically sought out land with one already in place. The original tunnel exists to this day, though the property has changed hands 7 times since Thomas built it. The cabin has been expanded and modernized. The barn has been rebuilt twice. But the tunnel remains, its timbering sound, its sod cover intact, still serving the purpose Thomas Farwell envisioned 150 years ago. Local historians estimate that Thomas's tunnel has provided shelter and safety for more than 3,000 individual passages during severe weather, spanning 15 decades of Montana winters. But the true measure of Thomas Farwell's innovation isn't in the survival of his own herd during the blizzard of 1873, though that was remarkable. It isn't even in the 70 to 90 tunnels that were built following his example, though those saved countless lives, both human and animal. The true measure is in the principle he demonstrated, the same principle that drives all successful adaptation to hostile environments. You can't control the weather, but you can control your relationship to it. His neighbors laughed when he started digging that spring of 1873. They laughed at the waste of effort, the foolishness of the enterprise, the sheer impracticality of burrowing through the earth like some kind of animal. They stopped laughing that December, when the temperature hit 42 below zero and the wind pushed conditions to 60 below. They stopped laughing when Thomas walked to his barn in a wool coat, while they were wrapping themselves in furs and risking death for the same journey. They stopped laughing when their cattle died and he lived. They stopped laughing that winter. And they never forgot what Thomas Farwell taught them about survival. That sometimes the crazy idea is the only sane response to an insane environment. That what looks like too much work in August might be the difference between life and death in December. That the earth itself, properly understood, provides everything needed for protection. You just have to be willing to dig deep enough to find it.